The house on Vinton Street in Tazewell was already crowded long before midnight arrived. It was a New Year's Eve gathering inside a private residence in the 100 block of Vinton Street, a holiday party that expanded as the night went on. Guests filtered in from different circles, friends of friends, people loosely connected by shared invitations rather than close relationships. Music filled the rooms. Alcohol was present. Conversations overlapped in spaces that were never meant to hold that many people at once. As midnight passed and January 1st, 2026 began, the environment inside the house grew tighter, not just socially, but physically. Hallways narrowed as people stood and talked. There was little separation between groups, little opportunity for privacy, and almost no room for anyone to step away from conflict without being noticed. Shortly after midnight, police say a fight broke out during the gathering. Investigators later confirmed that alcohol was a major contributing factor, but they have been careful in their wording beyond that. According to law enforcement, conflicting witness statements have made it difficult to determine exactly what sparked the confrontation. Different people inside the house perceived the same moments differently. In a crowded setting with loud music and heightened emotions, no single account captured the full picture. What is clear is that the argument escalated quickly. At some point during the confrontation, gunfire erupted inside the home. When officers arrived, they found 2 people had been shot. One victim, Brandon Deshaun Coxton, 30, of Tazewell, had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. He was pronounced dead as a result of the shooting. A second victim, Aiden Bennett Shelton, 18, had been struck by gunfire and was transported for medical treatment. Bennett Shelton was taken to Johnson City Regional Medical Center, where he was treated for gunshot wounds and later released. His injuries were serious enough to support a charge of aggravated malicious wounding, but he survived. The New Year's celebration was over. The house was sealed off as a crime scene. Party debris, cups, furniture, personal items remained where they fell as investigators began documenting evidence and separating witnesses. What had been a private holiday gathering became the focus of a multi-charge criminal investigation within hours of the new year beginning. Later that same day, police arrested Coven Bird Hall, 23, of Bluefield. Authorities described Bird Hall as a friend of the hosts, someone known socially within the group but not closely tied to the household. He was taken into custody on New Year's Day and formally charged in connection with the shooting. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors outlined the scope of the alleged violence. Bird Hall now faces multiple felony charges, including first-degree murder related to the death of Brandon Coxton, aggravated malicious wounding stemming from the shooting of Aiden Bennett Shelton, use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, 3 counts of malicious shooting at an occupied dwelling, reflecting gunfire discharged inside a residence where multiple people were present. On January 2nd, 2026, Bird Hall was arraigned in Tazewell County General District Court. During that appearance, the court ordered that he be held without bond, citing the severity of the charges and the alleged use of a firearm in a crowded residential setting. He remains incarcerated at the Southwest Virginia Regional Jail in Tazewell, where he has been held since his arrest. As of February 4, 2026, Bird Hall has been scheduled for a preliminary hearing in early February 2026, a proceeding that will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to move the case forward to a grand jury. No plea has been entered publicly, and the case remains in its early judicial stages while the legal process continues. Second case. Maya Liddell Banks was not supposed to be out that night. She was 26 years old, a hairstylist and braider who built her days around work, clients, and her 8-year-old daughter, Amani. Family members described her as a homebody, someone who usually chose quiet nights over crowded parties. But on New Year's Eve, as 2023 gave way to 2024, she decided to step outside her routine and celebrate in downtown Los Angeles. It was a rare choice, and it would cost her her life. Just before midnight, hundreds of people gathered at an unlicensed underground party inside a warehouse on the 2300 block of Porter Street near Santa Fe Avenue in an industrial section of downtown Los Angeles. The event had no permits, no formal security, no crowd limits. It was promoted through social media and word of mouth, drawing a dense crowd into a confined space designed for storage, not celebration. Music played, alcohol flowed, Phones lit up the room as people waited for the countdown. Shortly after midnight, at approximately 12:53 a.m. on January 1, 2024, the celebration collapsed. According to the Los Angeles Police Department, a dispute broke out between unknown individuals at the crowded party. What began as an argument escalated rapidly. Witnesses later said there was little warning. One moment people were celebrating, the next, gunfire erupted. The sound cut through music and shouting, instantly transforming the scene into chaos. When the shooting stopped, 2 people were dead. One was Maya Liddell Banks. The other was 24-year-old Devin Whitaker. 8 additional people were wounded, some seriously, as panic swept through the crowd. People ran for exits that were never meant to handle that many bodies at once. Some fell, others hid. A friend later told reporters that an announcement declaring the party was over had been made just minutes before the gunfire, an attempt to disperse a crowd already packed too tightly, too late. Within moments, police sirens replaced music and flashing lights washed over the street outside the warehouse. For Maya Banks, there was no escape window. She was struck during the gunfire and later pronounced dead. She would never return home to her daughter. In the hours that followed, investigators worked through a scene made complicated by the very nature of the event. Hundreds of attendees had fled in different directions. Many did not know one another. Alcohol and darkness blurred memories. Surveillance was limited. Detectives from the LAPD canvassed witnesses, reviewed available video, and confirmed what was already evident. This was an illegal, unregulated gathering that had spiraled out of control. The Los Angeles Times later reported that the party had been promoted online and drew several hundred people, despite lacking permits or safety oversight. There were no trained security staff to intervene when tensions rose, no structured plan for crowd dispersal, no safeguards to slow escalation once a conflict began. This is where environment matters. Alcohol and drugs did not create the violence that night. They lowered restraint. In crowded, unregulated spaces, substances act as accelerants, dulling judgment, amplifying ego, and shrinking the distance between irritation and action. In a setting already strained by overcrowding and noise, small conflicts can feel enormous. When restraint collapses, impulse takes over. Police emphasized that the shooting followed a dispute. They did not publicly identify a single motive or instigator in the immediate aftermath. What they did confirm was the pattern: a disagreement, access to firearms, and a space with no controls to interrupt escalation. Those facts offered little comfort to Maya's family. Friends and relatives described her as focused and hardworking, someone committed to her craft and proud of the clientele she had built as a stylist and braider in Los Angeles. She was a mother first. Her daughter Amani was 8 years old. Everything in Maya's life revolved around providing stability and care. That is what makes the night stand out so sharply. She rarely went out. She rarely attended parties. This was not her world. By the morning of January 1st, vigils began to appear. Candles replaced confetti. Social media filled with photos of Maya at work, smiling behind a salon chair, and messages mourning a life cut short. The new year began not with resolutions, but with grief. The investigation continued in the weeks that followed. As with many mass casualty shootings tied to chaotic gatherings, identifying shooters and assigning responsibility proved complex. Witnesses described confusion. Some heard shots inside. Others reported gunfire outside the warehouse as people exited. The disorder of the scene mirrored the lack of structure that allowed the party to exist in the first place. City officials and law enforcement reiterated warnings about underground events. Unpermitted parties, they said, remove layers of protection that people often take for granted. There is no screening, no crowd management, no trained personnel to de-escalate disputes. When something goes wrong, there is nothing to absorb the impact. If you're drawn to real crime stories that dig beneath the surface, tap like and subscribe to stay with us. Your support helps us bring more cases, deeper investigations, and stories that deserve to be heard. Third case. In North Austin, Texas, pressure gathered quietly during a New Year's celebration that stretched past midnight and into the early hours of January 1st, 2026. Nothing about the night suggested it would end with a homicide investigation. The danger was not announced. It was already present. The gathering took place at 7801 North Lamar Boulevard, Suite B148, a location operating as an event venue for the holiday. Guests arrived believing they were entering an organized New Year's party. Music played, alcohol circulated. People moved in and out of conversations, checking phones, marking the start of a new year with photos and messages. The night carried the familiar tension of New Year's Eve, expectation layered over exhaustion, celebration mixed with unresolved emotion. What guests did not know was that the venue itself would later become part of the investigation. Authorities determined after the shooting that the location was operating without the necessary city permits for an event of that size. The party had also been advertised as having security, yet police later discovered that a security camera inside the venue was unplugged at the time of the shooting, leaving a critical gap in surveillance during the most important moments of the night. These details did not cause the violence, but they shaped the environment in which it occurred. As midnight passed and January 1st began, tensions that did not originate that night resurfaced. According to the Austin Police Department arrest affidavit, the conflict involved a prior disagreement over a woman between Alton Williams III, then 19, and another individual who was with Isaiah Atkinson, 18. This dispute had history. It was not created by the celebration. It followed the people involved into the space, waiting for the right conditions to surface. Court documents later introduced an important nuance about where the confrontation unfolded. While many early reports described the shooting as occurring inside the venue, some court records indicate that the confrontation began outside the venue, where Williams encountered Atkinson and a witness. What is consistent across reporting is that the situation escalated rapidly in the early morning hours, culminating in gunfire. The precise boundary, inside or just outside, does not change the outcome, but it does clarify how quickly the conflict moved from confrontation to violence. At approximately 1:28 a.m., Austin police received a 911 call reporting a shooting at the North Lamar location. Officers arrived within minutes. They found Isaiah Atkinson suffering from a gunshot wound. Despite emergency response efforts, Atkinson was pronounced dead at the scene. The transition was immediate. Music stopped, conversations vanished, guests scattered into the night or stood frozen as flashing lights replaced party lighting. What had been a celebration minutes earlier became a sealed crime scene. The homicide was confirmed as Austin's first murder of 2026, a detail that gave the case immediate weight. While much of the city was still asleep or waking up to a holiday morning, one family was already facing irreversible loss. January 1st would no longer represent renewal for Isaiah Atkinson's loved ones. It would mark the moment time split into before and after. Investigators began the process of reconstructing the night. In crowded party environments, this task is rarely straightforward. Witnesses remember fragments, raised voices, movement, a sudden sound. Alcohol distorts perception. Fear reshapes memory. Detectives work to establish who was present, where the confrontation began, and how the escalation took place. Without functional interior surveillance footage, the investigation relied heavily on witness statements and physical evidence collected in and around the venue. The absence of effective security and surveillance became part of the broader context. Permits and safety measures exist to slow escalation, to provide oversight when large crowds gather. Their absence removes barriers that might otherwise interrupt a conflict. On a night already charged with emotion, that absence matters. Within days, police identified a suspect. On January 7, 2026, members of the U.S. Marshals Lone Star Fugitive Task Force located and arrested Alton Williams III in Pflugerville, Texas. He was taken into custody without incident and booked into the Travis County Jail. Williams was charged with first-degree murder, reflecting the seriousness of the allegation and the outcome of the shooting. Court records show that Williams was held on a total bond of $201,000. That amount combined a $200,000 bond for the murder charge and an additional $1,000 bond related to an out-of-county misdemeanor. The detail is precise, but it matters. Bond amounts signal how the justice system assesses risk, severity, and flight concerns in the early stages of a case. As the legal process moved forward, the facts remained consistent. An 18-year-old victim, a 19-year-old defendant, a New Year's celebration that ended in gunfire, a dispute rooted in past conflict rather than a spontaneous argument, an arrest made days later. The unresolved questions shifted from what happened to how did it reach this point. The fourth case. Scott Kalogi was 16 years old when New Year's Eve inside his family's home in Long Branch, New Jersey, ended in mass murder. On the night of December 31, 2017, relatives gathered to mark the end of the year. People moved between rooms. Some stepped outside briefly. The house carried the loose, unsettled energy common to holiday nights. Midnight was approaching, and nothing about the setting suggested that the evening would become a crime scene. What happened next did not begin with chaos. It began with preparation. According to prosecutors and later court findings, Scott Kalogi retrieved a semi-automatic rifle that belonged to his brother and had been left unsecured inside the home. Before firing a single shot, Kalogi took steps that would later become critical evidence at trial. He inserted earplugs to protect his hearing. He put on sunglasses despite it being nighttime and indoors. These actions were not disputed in court. They were presented as proof that the violence was anticipated, not impulsive. The first shots were fired upstairs. Inside the house, witnesses heard sharp, popping sounds, but context shaped perception. It was New Year's Eve. Fireworks and party poppers were expected. Several people later testified that they initially dismissed the sounds as part of the celebration. That assumption created delay, seconds, then longer, during which no one immediately reacted as if gunfire was occurring. One of Linda Kalogi's friends, who was inside the home, later testified that she saw bullet holes breaking through the ceiling, indicating that shots were being fired from the floor above. By the time the reality became clear, the sequence was already underway. Linda Kalogi was shot upstairs. Her husband, Stephen Kalogi, was also killed inside the house. Their daughter, Brittany Kalogi, attempted to escape and was shot as well. The final victim was Mary Schultz, the longtime companion of Kalogi's grandfather. In total, 14 rounds were fired and 12 struck their victims. Prosecutors repeatedly emphasized this ratio, arguing that it demonstrated controlled firing rather than panic. The shootings did not involve long pauses or visible hesitation. The movement through the house was continuous, and the violence did not stop until 4 people were dead. Not everyone present that night was killed, and the precise circumstances of survival became an important part of the factual record. Kalogi's grandfather survived inside the home. Kalogi's brother, Stephen Jr., was not hiding inside. Court records clarified that he was outside the house, looking through a window, when the shooting began. His girlfriend was also present and survived by avoiding detection. These details mattered because they showed how fragmented awareness was in those moments. People were present but separated by walls, floors, and positioning. No one had a full view of events early enough to intervene. Police were eventually called, and Kalogi was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. What investigators uncovered afterward fundamentally reshaped how the crime was understood. This was not a sudden eruption tied to a family argument that night. Court records showed that Kalogi had spent months researching violence. In addition to studying mass shootings and casualty counts, prosecutors revealed that he specifically researched whether the rifle would be effective against police officers wearing bulletproof vests. That detail suggested he was thinking beyond the house, about confrontation, response, and continuation. The timing of the attack mattered. Prosecutors argued that New Year's Eve provided opportunity rather than provocation. Multiple family members would be present in one place. Noise would be normalized. Movement would not immediately raise alarm. The environment worked in his favor. The legal process moved slowly. In 2019, Kalogi was indicted as an adult despite being a juvenile at the time of the killings. That decision drew national attention and set the stage for a case centered on intent, mental health, and accountability. The trial did not begin immediately. Proceedings were delayed for several reasons, including the COVID-19 pandemic, stretching the pretrial period over years. Kalogi's trial concluded in February 2022. A jury found him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with related weapons offenses. During sentencing arguments, prosecutors emphasized the preparation, the number of victims, and the controlled nature of the shootings. The defense argued that his age and mental health history should mitigate punishment. In June 2022, Kalogi was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, totaling 150 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. The sentencing judge stated that the scale of the violence and the evidence of preparation left no legal basis for leniency, even considering his youth. The case did not end there. Appeals followed, focusing on whether Kukreja's age and psychological condition should have resulted in a lesser sentence. On January 30, 2025, a New Jersey appellate court officially upheld both his convictions and the full 150-year sentence, rejecting defense arguments that the punishment was excessive or unlawful. The court ruled that the trial judge acted within state law and sentencing guidelines. As of February 4, 2026, Kukreja remains incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, serving his sentence under the custody of the New Jersey Department of Corrections. His legal status has not changed since the appellate ruling. If these stories have kept you watching, please hit the like button and subscribe for more true crime stories every week. Your support keeps these investigations coming and helps the channel grow. The fifth case. The Embassy Suites Friendship Heights was quiet from the outside in the early hours of January 1, 2024. Its windows lit softly above the street as the new year settled in. Inside, on the 7th floor, a New Year's Eve party was still in motion just after 1 a.m. Music echoed through the hallway. Guests moved between rooms, gathering belongings, laughing, lingering. The setting looked controlled, familiar, safe, the kind of place where danger feels out of place. That sense of safety was an illusion. Inside one of the rooms was Ashley Hines, 18 years old. She was a freshman at Louisiana State University, home in the Washington area for winter break. Like many others her age, she was welcoming the new year in a group setting, surrounded by peers, in a space that felt insulated from harm. There was no indication that she was at the center of any conflict. By all accounts, she was not involved in the dispute that would ultimately cost her life. According to witness statements later cited in charging documents, tension had been building inside the room well before the shooting. Jelani Cousin, also 18, was accused by multiple guests of making unwanted sexual advances toward an intoxicated female guest. The accusation triggered a confrontation. Voices were raised. The mood shifted. What had been a party began to fracture internally, even as it continued outwardly. Witnesses told investigators that Cousin became agitated during the argument. At one point, he allegedly threatened to blow this spot up. The remark did not immediately stop the party. Music continued. Guests assumed the situation would de-escalate. Instead, Cousin was forcibly removed from the room and pushed into the hallway. The door was closed behind him. This moment marked the collapse point of the celebration's illusion. The conflict was no longer visible, but it was not resolved. Inside the room, guests began gathering their things, preparing to leave. Ashley Hines was among them, standing near the door, ready to move on from a night that had grown uncomfortable. She had no role in the confrontation. She was not part of the argument. She was simply present. From the hallway, according to police charging documents, Cousin produced a firearm. He fired 2 shots through the closed door and into the room. The bullets crossed the thin boundary between public hallway and private gathering. One struck Ashley Hines in the chest. She collapsed inside the room, critically wounded. The sound of gunfire cut through the hotel floor instantly. Music stopped. Screams replaced laughter. Guests ran or froze in place. Within minutes, the 7th floor was locked down. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but Ashley Hines was pronounced dead at the hotel. What had been a New Year's celebration minutes earlier was now a homicide scene. Metropolitan Police Department officers secured the floor, evacuated guests, and began separating witnesses. Surveillance footage from the hotel was preserved. Statements were collected. The setting itself became evidence, illustrating how quickly an indoor, well-lit, mainstream environment can turn lethal when tension meets access to a weapon. Coverage from Fox 5 DC and other local outlets showed the immediate aftermath. Police vehicles outside the hotel, shaken teenagers wrapped in blankets, families arriving in panic. The case was soon identified as the first homicide of 2024 in Washington, D.C., a detail that highlighted how abruptly the new year had begun. On January 2, 2024, Jelani Cousin turned himself in to authorities. He was arrested and initially charged with second-degree murder. At that stage, prosecutors focused on the act of firing into an occupied room with deadly consequences. But as investigators continued reviewing evidence, the legal scope of the case widened significantly. A grand jury later indicted Cousin on 15 charges, including first-degree premeditated murder. Prosecutors argued that the sequence of events, being removed from the room, making threats, positioning himself in the hallway, and firing multiple shots through a closed door, demonstrated intent rather than a momentary lapse of control. The escalation from second-degree to first-degree charges reframed the case from a tragic altercation to an alleged deliberate act. As the legal process unfolded, additional details emerged through court filings and reporting from D.C. Witness. In November 2025, Cousin rejected a plea deal offered by prosecutors. He is currently being held pending trial, with a jury trial scheduled for March 2027. The case remains active, with prosecutors seeking to prove premeditation and defense attorneys challenging the interpretation of events. The sixth case. There was no other motive than robbery, and investigators have never wavered on that point. In the early hours of January 1, 2017, Adrian Anguiano was shot in the neck and his Louis Vuitton backpack was stolen. There was no ideological dispute, no prolonged personal feud made public, and no evidence of a long-running conflict that night. The violence centered on taking property, executed in a moment when chaos offered cover and restraint failed. The setting mattered. The party was held at the Trails of Redmond Apartments in Redmond, Washington, and it was never meant to be as large as it became. What began as a New Year's Eve gathering expanded rapidly after details spread on social media. By the time midnight passed, official reports confirmed that more than 200 people were present. Guests spilled out of individual apartments and into shared spaces. Music carried across the complex. Movement was constant, and familiarity disappeared as strangers mixed freely. At around 2 a.m., the night destabilized further. A fire alarm was triggered, reportedly after people smoked indoors. The alarm forced a sudden evacuation. Doors opened. People poured into outdoor areas near the cabana and clubhouse. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. The crowd shifted from celebration to irritation and confusion in seconds. This evacuation is critical to understanding what happened next, because it created a dense, disorganized mass of people in transitional space, neither fully inside nor fully outside, neither settled nor paying close attention. It was during this evacuation, just outside the cabana/clubhouse area, that Adrian Anguiano was shot. The act did not occur deep inside a packed room, nor in a quiet, isolated corner. It happened in the middle of movement, as people were leaving due to the alarm. Investigators later confirmed that Adrian was struck in the neck and robbed in that same moment. The sequence was brief. There was no extended struggle described in official accounts. A firearm was produced, a shot was fired, property was taken, and the person responsible disappeared into the shifting crowd. The environment immediately after the gunshot added another layer of confusion. Fireworks had been going off throughout the night, and some witnesses did not initially register the sound as a gunshot. Others were focused on exiting because of the alarm. Panic spread unevenly. Some people ran, others froze. By the time the seriousness of the situation became clear, the shooter had already blended into the mass of people dispersing across the complex. Emergency calls reached authorities, and first responders arrived to find Adrian critically injured. Despite medical efforts, he did not survive. The new year was barely 2 hours old. What had been a celebration ended as a homicide scene shaped by disorder and delay. From the beginning, investigators faced a structural problem rather than a lack of evidence. The crowd itself was the obstacle. With more than 200 people present, many of whom did not know one another, movement patterns were impossible to track cleanly. Guests had arrived at different times, left in different directions, and in some cases could not even identify which apartment they had originally been visiting. Alcohol impaired memory. Darkness obscured faces. The fire alarm ensured that no one was standing still. Law enforcement canvassed the area, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed available surveillance footage. What they collected were fragments, partial descriptions, conflicting timelines, and impressions rather than certainties. Some people remembered seeing Adrian earlier in the night. Others remembered the alarm. Many remembered the fear, but not the face of the person who fired the shot. Coverage by Fox 13 Seattle later emphasized the same reality investigators had been confronting since 2017. This case was not stalled because no one was present. It was stalled because too many people were present, and the moment of violence was buried inside forced movement and noise. The evacuation created the perfect conditions for anonymity. Investigators confirmed that Adrian's Louis Vuitton backpack was taken, grounding the case firmly in robbery rather than accident or misidentification. That detail narrowed the motive but did not reveal the perpetrator. The shooter acted with intent to steal, but without any visible plan beyond the moment itself. There was no attempt to help, no attempt to conceal the victim, only escape. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued without an arrest. The case eventually cooled, though it was never closed. Law enforcement continued to appeal for information, stressing that someone in that crowd saw or knew something meaningful, even if they did not witness the shooting directly. Over time, the case was classified as a cold case, and the reward for information was raised to $5,000 in hopes of generating new leads. Seventh case, January 1st, 2023. Just minutes after midnight, as fireworks lit the sky and families across the country welcomed a new year, an 11-year-old girl named Amethyst Silva was standing outside the Allure Apartments in Corpus Christi, Texas, celebrating with her family. It was a moment meant to feel hopeful. Instead, it became the moment her life ended. The sounds that filled the air that night were familiar: countdowns, laughter, fireworks cracking overhead. Mixed into that noise were gunshots, not aimed at anyone, not fired during an argument, fired upward, illegally, as part of celebratory gunfire. One of those bullets did not disappear into the night. It came back down. Amethyst was struck by a falling or stray bullet, a fact later confirmed by investigators and prosecutors. There was no warning, no sign that danger was close. 1 second she was watching fireworks. The next, everything changed. At first, there was confusion rather than instant panic. Reports later showed that Amethyst's family struggled to get through to emergency dispatchers. As the seriousness of her injury became clear, her father made a decision that many parents can understand instinctively. He did not wait. He placed his daughter in his vehicle and drove her to the hospital himself, racing through the early minutes of the new year, hoping time was still on their side. It wasn't. Amethyst Silva died from her injuries shortly after arriving at the hospital. She was 11 years old. Her death marked one of the most devastating New Year's Eve celebratory gunfire incidents in recent U.S. history. The investigation that followed uncovered a reality that complicated the case from the start. The fatal bullet was never recovered. District attorneys later explained that without the bullet itself, it was impossible to determine which specific firearm fired the round that killed Amethyst. That missing piece of evidence would shape every legal decision that followed. What investigators could establish was this: multiple people in the area had fired guns into the air during the celebration. Celebratory gunfire is illegal precisely because of what happened that night. Bullets fired upward do not vanish. They slow, fall, and return to the ground with lethal force. The physics are simple. The consequences are not. As detectives canvassed the area, an unexpected detail became critical. A family photo taken just before the shooting, meant to capture a joyful New Year's moment, had also captured people in the background. That image, frozen in time before everything went wrong, helped police identify individuals who were later named as suspects. Those leads brought investigators to Dionys Poindexter, then 29 years old, and Jacob Leal, then 43. Both men were arrested in connection with the gunfire. Initially, prosecutors charged them with deadly conduct, reflecting the danger of firing weapons in a residential area where families were gathered. As the investigation continued and the full impact of Amethyst's death became unavoidable, the case evolved. In 2024, prosecutors upgraded the charges to include criminally negligent homicide. Authorities were careful to explain why murder charges were not pursued. There was no evidence of intent to kill. The fatal bullet was never found. But negligence, they argued, was undeniable. Firing a gun into the air on New Year's Eve is not an accident. It is a conscious decision to ignore risk. And when that risk results in a child's death, the law still demands accountability. The case moved slowly, as many complex criminal cases do. Months became years. For Amethyst's family, time did not lessen the loss, it stretched it. In February 2026, more than 3 years after her death, jury selection began for Dionys Poindexter's trial, with opening arguments expected shortly after. The long delay was procedural, but the pain behind it never paused. The 8 case. 4 men: Duchesne Michael, Gregory Hawley, Lamech Gordon Carew and Elise Spence were charged with murder. The case was tried at Maidstone Crown Court. The prosecution did not need to prove which defendant delivered which blow. Instead, they argued joint participation, that the defendants acted together, encouraging or taking part in the violence that led to Bill's death. That legal framing shaped everything the jury heard. This was not a case built around a single weapon, a single strike, or a single eyewitness who saw everything clearly. It was a case about accumulation of actions, of choices, of moments where the opportunity to stop what was happening passed without intervention. The court was asked to look at what happened collectively, rather than isolating individual seconds or individual hands. The violence itself took place during a New Year's Eve party in the early hours of January 1, 2020, inside a disused and unsecured building on North Street in Brighton. The building had become a temporary gathering space, drawing people in with music, alcohol, and the sense that normal boundaries did not apply. There was no formal event, no host, no supervision. People arrived and left throughout the night. What happened inside would later be reconstructed only in fragments. The victim, Bill Hen, was 24 years old. He had traveled to Brighton for the new year. Witnesses later told police that Bill appeared relaxed when he arrived, moving between rooms, speaking with others, and showing no signs of distress. These details mattered because they established a clear before and after. Bill was conscious and uninjured shortly before the violence began. At some point after midnight, Bill became the focus of an attack. The precise trigger was never definitively identified, and no single witness could describe the entire sequence from start to finish. What prosecutors were able to establish was that the assault was sustained and involved multiple people. Bill was beaten until he lost consciousness. He was kicked and stamped on while on the floor. A wooden banister spindle, torn from the structure of the building itself, was used to strike him. The post-mortem examination later revealed the extent of the injuries. Bill had suffered more than 60 separate injuries, including multiple broken ribs, extensive bruising, and severe head trauma. The medical examiner told the court that these injuries were consistent with repeated blows delivered over a period of time. They were not consistent with a brief fight, a fall, or an isolated act of violence. By the time the assault ended, Bill was already critically injured. What followed the attack became a central part of the prosecution's case. Evidence showed that the defendants did not immediately flee the building or seek medical help. Instead, they took actions that investigators said demonstrated awareness and intent to conceal what had occurred. Bill's body was stripped naked inside the building. Disinfectant and bleach were used to wash his body and parts of the surrounding area, an act prosecutors argued was aimed at destroying DNA evidence and removing visible signs of the assault. Forensic analysis later confirmed the presence of cleaning chemicals at the scene. These actions were significant because they suggested a pause, a moment where decisions were made. The violence had already occurred. Bill was already incapacitated. The effort to clean the scene showed that what followed was not chaos or panic, but deliberate behavior. The prosecution relied heavily on this point to counter any claim that the event spiraled out of control without intent. Digital evidence reinforced that interpretation. Analysis of mobile phones seized during the investigation revealed that Dušan Miklo had taken 2 photographs of Bill's body after the assault. One image showed Bill partially clothed, the other showed him naked. Both images were later deleted. While the photos themselves were not fully recoverable, forensic specialists were able to confirm their existence and deletion. Prosecutors argued that photographing the body and then removing the images showed consciousness of guilt rather than confusion or shock. After these actions inside the building, Bill was taken to a balcony or roof terrace area overlooking a recessed courtyard below. Once again, witness accounts fractured. Some said they saw Bill being moved. Others said they arrived only after he was already unconscious. Some said they left the building before anything serious happened. No single account covered every moment. What the jury ultimately accepted was that Bill was thrown from the balcony, falling into the courtyard below. The fall caused additional injuries, but it did not explain the totality of the trauma. The medical examiner concluded that Bill died from a combination of severe blunt force trauma and the fall from height, and that the injuries inflicted before the fall were already life-threatening. This finding was critical. It meant Bill's death could not be dismissed as a tragic accident or an unintended consequence of a push. The assault was a substantial and deliberate cause of death. When emergency services arrived, Bill was pronounced dead at the scene. By that point, the party had already begun to dissolve. People left quietly or in small groups. Some spoke to police immediately. Others did not come forward until much later. The investigation that followed reflected this fragmentation. Detectives from Sussex Police had to build the case without a single authoritative eyewitness narrative. CCTV footage from surrounding streets showed who entered and left the area, but not what happened inside the building. Phone records placed individuals at the location during key periods, but could not show their actions. Witnesses remembered isolated details, voices raised, movement on staircases, sudden silence, but often could not say how those moments connected. Rather than a straight line, the investigation became a process of overlap and corroboration. Witness testimony during the trial added further insight into the aftermath. One key witness told the court that Gregory Hawley later spoke about Bill's final moments with what they described as no emotion in his eyes. The witness recalled Hawley bragging about the victim's last breath. Prosecutors argued that this statement revealed an awareness of Bill's condition and a disturbing lack of remorse, reinforcing the case that the violence was intentional and understood by those involved. Throughout the trial, the defense emphasized the lack of a single eyewitness and the inconsistencies between accounts. The prosecution responded by arguing that such fragmentation was exactly what one would expect in a group attack. Responsibility spreads, memory fractures. Silence becomes a form of protection. The law, they reminded the jury, does not require a perfect narrative, only proof beyond reasonable doubt that the defendants acted together. On February 24, 2022, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts against all 4 defendants. In May 2022, each man was sentenced to life imprisonment, with minimum terms ranging from 18 to 25 years. The sentencing judge described the attack as brutal and emphasized that Bill had been completely defenseless. Ninth case. Andre Kukreja was 24 years old when he finished his shift on the night of December 31, 2023. He'd been working at a Wingstop in San Pedro, and his shift ended at around 10 p.m. It was an ordinary end to a workday, the kind that blends into routine. After clocking out, he made plans to join a New Year's Eve house party in Manhattan Beach. Like many people his age, he was moving from responsibility into celebration, from work into the promise of a new year. The party was taking place at a home on the 1400 block of 11th Street, near Peck Avenue. Local reporting later confirmed that the house was well known in the neighborhood for hosting large gatherings and for previous noise complaints. On New Year's Eve, the crowd was sizable. Music carried beyond the property. Guests moved in and out of the house and onto the street. Midnight passed. The year changed. For a brief moment, the night followed the familiar shape of celebration. At approximately 1:23 a.m. on January 1, 2024, Manhattan Beach police were dispatched to the area, not because of a reported shooting, but because of a reported traffic collision. That initial call is important. Officers were not responding to an active crime scene. When they arrived on the 1400 block of 11th Street, they discovered Andre Kukreja lying in the street. He had suffered a gunshot wound to the head. He was unresponsive but still alive. Paramedics were called immediately. Giannan was transported to a nearby hospital in critical condition. As emergency vehicles arrived, the atmosphere around the house changed completely. The party did not continue. Music stopped. The gathering broke apart. What had been a crowded New Year's celebration ended without ceremony, leaving behind a street that no longer matched the night it had been hosting minutes earlier. This is where the story shifts from the act itself to what followed. The defining feature of this case is not prolonged chaos, but abrupt absence. The party did not resume. There was no gradual winding down. Guests left quickly or quietly. Police secured the area as they began to understand what they were dealing with. Decorations, cups, and cars remained, but the energy that had filled the space disappeared all at once. Giannan did not die that night. For 3 days he remained hospitalized in critical condition. Those days mattered deeply. His family waited without certainty, caught between medical updates and silence. While the rest of the city moved forward into January, time slowed for those closest to him. On January 4, 2024, authorities confirmed that Andre Kukreja had died from his injuries. With that confirmation, the case officially became a homicide. According to KTLA 5 News and corroborating local outlets, investigators began working to determine how and why the shooting occurred. Manhattan Beach Police stated publicly that they did not believe the shooting was random, despite the number of people present and the disorder of a large party environment. That assessment suggested intent, familiarity, or a specific conflict rather than indiscriminate violence. The investigation faced immediate challenges. Although detectives canvassed the neighborhood and reviewed available surveillance footage, many nearby residents reported that they did not hear anything unusual that night. On New Year's Eve, loud noises blend. Fireworks, music, voices, and traffic make it difficult to distinguish danger from celebration. In this case, the lack of clear auditory witnesses complicated efforts to establish a precise sequence of events. Police interviewed dozens of people who had attended the party. That volume of witnesses did not guarantee clarity. Alcohol affected memory. Darkness obscured movement. People arrived and left at different times. Surveillance footage showed fragments, cars passing, individuals entering and exiting, but not the full context of what led to Giannon being found in the street. This is a recurring pattern in New Year's Eve cases involving violence. The night compresses too much into too little time. Emotions are elevated. Judgment is impaired. Crowds form quickly and dissolve just as fast. When something goes wrong, the evidence scatters with the people. The location itself added another layer. The home on the 1400 block of 11th Street had drawn police attention in the past for loud parties. On this night, that reputation meant a large gathering with limited oversight. When officers arrived after the collision call, they stepped into a space that had already emptied. The absence of noise was as notable as the earlier presence of it. 10th case. As midnight passed and January 1st, 1998 began, the celebration continued into the early hours. Ben Smart and Olivia Hope met during the night. Like many others, they moved between groups, boats, and conversations. At some point after 3 a.m., they attempted to return to the vessel they had planned to sleep on, a chartered boat called the Tamarack. Witnesses later confirmed the Tamarack was already full. There was no room for them to stay. The night itself had been large, loose, and unstructured. Between 1,500 and 2,000 people had gathered at Furneaux Lodge for one of the biggest New Year's Eve events in the country. Boats filled the bay, some anchored, others drifting slowly as people came and went. Music carried across the water, alcohol flowed freely. Strangers spoke easily, and plans changed without friction. Ben Smart, 21, and Olivia Hope, 17, had arrived separately, each expecting nothing more than a night of celebration and a place to sleep before morning. When the Tamarack proved unavailable, the situation was not dramatic. There was no argument, no urgency, no visible distress. They were simply two people at the end of a long night, looking for somewhere to rest. It was at this point that a lone man entered the picture. According to later testimony, he offered Ben and Olivia a place to stay on his yacht. The offer was practical. It solved an immediate problem. In the atmosphere of New Year's Eve, surrounded by boats and people doing the same thing, it did not stand out as dangerous. One of the key witnesses to this interaction was Guy Wallace, a water taxi driver working throughout the night. Wallace's role placed him repeatedly among the same cluster of boats, and he later told police that he saw Ben and Olivia speaking with a lone man after discovering they could not return to the Tamarack. Wallace stated that the man offered them accommodation on his boat and that the pair accepted. His testimony would later become one of the most important and most contested pieces of the entire case. Between approximately 3:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. on January 1st, 1998, Ben Smart and Olivia Hope were seen boarding a vessel with that man. Multiple witnesses placed the timing within this narrow window. No one reported an argument. No one reported fear. The night simply moved forward, as nights like that often do. That moment, quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable at the time, became the last confirmed sighting of either of them alive. Morning brought change without answers. Boats began leaving the bay. Partygoers woke up where they had slept and made their way home. At first, there was no alarm. Friends assumed Ben and Olivia had stayed elsewhere and would surface later in the day. As hours passed, concern grew. By the end of New Year's Day, it was clear something was wrong. Searches began around Furneaux Lodge and quickly expanded across the Marlborough Sounds. From the beginning, investigators faced a defining problem. There was no confirmed crime scene. There were no bodies, no distress calls, no damaged vessel, and no physical sign that a crime had occurred at all. The case would have to be built entirely from witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and fragments of forensic material recovered later. Time worked against clarity. Tides moved, boats came and went. The environment itself erased detail. As police reconstructed the final hours of the night, the description of the boat Ben and Olivia boarded became critical. Guy Wallace consistently described the vessel as a two-masted wooden ketch. This was not a minor detail. A ketch has a distinct profile, with two masts set apart in a way that is difficult to confuse with other designs. Wallace maintained this description in early statements, identifying features he said were visible even in low light. The investigation eventually focused on Scott Watson, a local fisherman who owned a boat named Blade. Watson acknowledged being in the Marlborough Sounds that night but denied having any contact with Ben Smart or Olivia Hope. His boat, however, was a single-masted steel sloop, not a two-masted wooden ketch. The discrepancy between Wallace's description and Watson's vessel would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Despite this conflict, Watson was charged with the murders of Ben Smart and Olivia Hope in 1998. The prosecution did not claim to have a single decisive piece of proof. Instead, the case was built on accumulation. The Crown argued that Watson's movements, witness sightings, and forensic findings, when viewed together, established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. At trial in 1999, jurors heard how difficult it was to reconstruct a night defined by alcohol, darkness, and shifting boats. Witnesses described impressions formed in passing, conversations overheard, silhouettes on decks, brief interactions remembered later under pressure. The defense challenged the reliability of these accounts, emphasizing how memory can change over time, especially when shaped by repeated questioning. One of the most significant pieces of evidence presented by the Crown came from Watson's boat. 2 blonde hairs were found on a blanket aboard Blade. DNA testing linked those hairs to Olivia Hope. Prosecutors presented this as critical corroboration, placing Olivia on Watson's vessel. The defense responded with a challenge that would fuel controversy for decades. The hair samples were examined on the same day as Olivia Hope's reference samples at New Zealand's ESR laboratory. The defense argued this raised the possibility of contamination. Experts disagreed on the likelihood, but the debate showed how fragile evidence can be in a case without bodies. Witness reliability remained another fault line. Guy Wallace later recanted his identification of Watson as the man he had seen that night. Wallace stated that he felt pressured by police and that he had been shown a rapidly flashed blink photograph that made Watson resemble the mystery man. Prosecutors argued that Wallace's earliest statements were the most reliable and that later doubts did not erase what he originally reported. The jury accepted the Crown's position. In June 1999, Scott Watson was found guilty of murdering Ben Smart and Olivia Hope. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a 17-year non-parole period. The verdict was rare and consequential. Murder convictions without recovered bodies are uncommon, and the case immediately became one of the most scrutinized in New Zealand's legal history. Appeals followed. Watson maintained his innocence. Supporters argued that the ketch versus sloop discrepancy, the handling of the hair evidence, and the evolution of witness testimony pointed to a miscarriage of justice. Courts reviewed these arguments repeatedly. Each time, the conviction was upheld. As recently as September 2025, the Court of Appeal of New Zealand dismissed Watson's latest appeal, ruling that no miscarriage of justice had occurred. 11th case. A post-mortem examination later revealed the full extent of the violence. Janvi had suffered 48 ante-mortem injuries inflicted while she was still alive. The wounds were spread across her body from head to toe. The medical findings ruled out the possibility of a simple fall down the stairs. The number, nature, and distribution of injuries pointed to a sustained physical assault. Those medical conclusions set the direction of the investigation from the very beginning. Janvi Kukreja was only 19 years old, a psychology student living with her family in Bhagwati Heights, a residential building in Kar West, Mumbai. On the night of December 31, 2020, she attended a New Year's Eve party held within the housing society itself. It was not a public event or a crowded nightclub. It was a gathering of residents and friends hosted on the terrace of the building where she lived. As midnight passed and January 1st, 2021 began, the celebration continued into the early hours. Music played, conversations overlapped, groups shifted as people moved between the terrace, corridors, and stairwells. Witnesses later told police that Janvi spent much of the night in the company of two close friends, Shri Jogdankar and Dia Padalkar. To those around them, nothing appeared overtly alarming. The gathering looked like countless other New Year's Eve parties held across the city. What followed, however, occurred away from the crowd. According to the court's findings, the altercation that led to Janvi's death did not begin at the ground floor. Evidence placed the initial confrontation on the upper levels of the building, with witness accounts and circumstantial material indicating the 5th or 8th floor as the starting point. From there, the situation escalated as the group moved downward through the staircase. This progression became a crucial part of the court's understanding of the violence. As they descended floor by floor, the confrontation intensified. By the time they reached the 2nd floor, the dispute had turned physical. It was from this level that Janvi was ultimately pushed or thrown, according to the prosecution's case accepted by the court with respect to Jogdankar. The fall and subsequent assault resulted in the extensive injuries documented in the post-mortem report. In the early morning hours, Janvi Kukreja was found lying in the ground floor lobby area near the staircase. She was unresponsive. Emergency services were alerted, but the severity of her condition was immediately apparent. Visible injuries indicated that this was not a medical emergency caused by exhaustion or intoxication. From the outset, the scene pointed toward violence. Mumbai police, operating through the Khar police station, launched a detailed investigation. Officers examined the staircase and lobby area, collected CCTV footage from inside the building, and recorded statements from residents and party attendees. Phone records were analyzed to establish movements and communication during the final hours of the night. One piece of physical evidence became particularly significant during the trial. Investigators recovered clumps of hair along the stairwell, which the court later described as clinching evidence of a violent physical struggle. This finding directly contradicted any suggestion that Janvi's injuries could have resulted from a single accidental fall. Combined with the medical evidence of 48 ante-mortem injuries, it reinforced the conclusion that she had been subjected to repeated force as the confrontation unfolded across multiple floors. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, attention focused on the last people known to be with Janvi. Both Shri Jogdankar and Dia Padalkar had remained with her after the terrace party ended. Police questioned why there had been no immediate attempt to seek medical help despite the severity of her injuries. Inconsistencies in statements and behavior became part of the circumstantial case presented by the prosecution. Based on forensic findings, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence, police filed a charge sheet accusing both Jogdankar and Padalkar of murder under the Indian Penal Code. The case drew widespread attention because it did not involve a stranger or an intruder. It centered on a small group of friends inside a private residential building, challenging assumptions about safety in familiar spaces. The trial that followed stretched over several years. Medical experts testified about the nature and extent of Janvi's injuries. Forensic analysts explained the significance of evidence recovered from the staircase. Police officers described the investigation and the sequence of events as they understood it. Throughout the proceedings, the medical findings remained a constant anchor. The injuries were too numerous and too severe to be explained as an accident. The prosecution advanced a specific motive theory, which the court ultimately accepted in Jogdankar's case. According to this theory, a dispute arose involving Jogdankar's alleged intimacy with Padalkar, leading to a confrontation with Janvi. The argument escalated as they moved down the staircase, culminating in the fatal act on the 2nd floor. The court found that this version of events was supported by the physical evidence, the distribution of injuries, and the continuity of the altercation across multiple floors. The defense challenged the prosecution's case, particularly with respect to Padalkar. While acknowledging her presence during parts of the incident, the defense argued that there was no cogent evidence proving her active participation in the fatal assault. This distinction between presence and participation became central to the court's final decision. The judgment also addressed investigative shortcomings. In its ruling, the court noted defective police evidence collection, including instances where forensic materials were improperly sealed, creating gaps in the chain of custody. These procedural flaws weakened portions of the prosecution's case, particularly where the evidence against Padalkar was concerned. While the court found the circumstantial chain against Jogdankar to be complete despite these issues, the same could not be said for Padalkar. In January 2026, nearly 5 years after Janvi Kukreja's death, the Mumbai Sessions Court delivered its verdict. Shri Jogdankar was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The court held that the evidence against him, medical findings, physical proof, and the established sequence of events met the standard required for conviction beyond reasonable doubt. Dia Padalkar was acquitted, with the court granting her the benefit of doubt. The judgment emphasized that while she was present during the relevant time period, the prosecution had failed to establish her direct involvement in the fatal assault with sufficient certainty. The investigative lapses in evidence handling played a role in this conclusion, highlighting how procedural errors can shape legal outcomes. The split verdict highlighted the court's reliance on precision rather than speculation. One accused was held criminally responsible and sentenced to spend his life in prison. The other was cleared under the law, not because the violence was in question, but because the evidence did not meet the strict threshold required for conviction. 12th case. On January 21, 2023, Hukan Tran, age 72, entered the Star Ballroom dance studio in Monterey Park, California, during Lunar New Year celebrations. Inside, dozens of people, mostly older adults, had gathered for an evening of social dancing tied to one of the most important holidays in the Chinese lunar calendar. For many in attendance, this was not a special outing but a familiar routine. They came to dance, to socialize, and to mark the start of a new year built around continuity and renewal. By the end of the night, 11 people would be dead and 9 others wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting in Los Angeles County history. The Star Ballroom was a long-standing fixture in the community. Many patrons had attended events there for years, sometimes decades. The crowd that night reflected that history. Victims ranged in age from their 50s to their 90s. Witnesses later described a calm atmosphere before the violence began. Music played, couples moved across the floor. There were no reports of arguments or visible disturbances. The setting mattered because it was defined by trust and familiarity, not chaos. Shortly after 10:20 p.m., Tran opened fire inside the ballroom. The weapon he carried was a Cobra M11-9, a semi-automatic pistol that is illegal in California due to its design, modifications, and ability to accept high-capacity magazines. The gunfire was sudden and overwhelming. Music stopped instantly. People fell where they stood. Survivors later told investigators there was little time to process what was happening, much less escape. The layout of the room, walls, limited exits, and a crowded floor compressed time and movement. Within minutes, 11 people had been killed and 9 others seriously wounded. After the shooting, Tran left the Star Ballroom and drove away. He did not immediately flee the area. Investigators later confirmed that he traveled to a second Lunar New Year celebration in the nearby city of Alhambra at the Lai Lai Ballroom. This was not a random choice. Authorities later clarified that Tran had been a former regular at both dance studios. Years earlier, he had met his ex-wife at the Star Ballroom. Those connections added a personal dimension that was not immediately apparent on the night of the attack. When Tran arrived at the Lai Lai Ballroom, the dynamic inside the room shifted. Staff and patrons noticed his behavior as he entered the lobby. Brandon Say, a 26-year-old manager at the venue, confronted him. A struggle followed. Say wrestled the firearm away from Tran and chased him out of the building. Tran fled the scene, leaving the weapon behind. Law enforcement later stated that this intervention almost certainly prevented another mass casualty shooting. The contrast between the two locations became one of the most important elements of the case. At the Star Ballroom, violence took place without interruption. At the Lai Lai Ballroom, it was stopped. The same internal escalation crossed into a different room, but the outcome changed because of immediate human action. The difference was not awareness of danger ahead of time. It was the response once the threat was physically present. As the scope of the attack became clear, law enforcement launched a county-wide manhunt. Alerts were issued and residents were urged to remain vigilant. Tran was identified quickly. In the early hours of January 22, 2023, police located him inside a white cargo van in Torrance, California. Officers surrounded the vehicle and attempted to make contact. Before Tran could be taken into custody, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Inside the van, authorities recovered the Cobra pistol, ammunition, and additional items linked to the attack. The manhunt ended without further loss of life, but it also ended without immediate answers. In the hours after the shooting, investigators stated there was no known personal connection between Tran and the victims present that night. However, as the investigation continued, that picture became more complex. Law enforcement later clarified that Tran had previously been a regular patron at the Star Ballroom and the Lai Ballroom. His personal history with the venues, including his past relationship with his ex-wife, became part of the broader context examined by investigators. Some reports suggested that jealousy, resentment, or unresolved personal grievances tied to his earlier years in the dance community may have played a role, though authorities emphasized that no definitive motive could be confirmed. Another detail emerged days later. Sheriff Robert Luna confirmed that Tran had sent writings to law enforcement before the attack. These documents were described as a manifesto and were later analyzed by the FBI. Officials stated that the writings did not clearly articulate a specific motive tied directly to the victims or the events that night, and much of their content was not publicly released. What was disclosed added to a portrait of a man experiencing long-standing paranoia and mental health struggles. Investigators revealed that Tran had previously visited police stations claiming his family was poisoning him. These encounters did not result in criminal charges or involuntary detention, but they were reviewed after the shooting as part of the effort to understand his state of mind. Authorities stressed that while these details provided context, they did not offer a simple explanation for the violence. The cultural impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate crime scene. Lunar New Year is one of the most significant celebrations in Asian communities worldwide. In Monterey Park, where a majority of residents are Asian American, the holiday carries deep generational meaning. It centers on honoring elders, strengthening family bonds, and welcoming a fresh start. Many of the victims embodied those values. Their deaths transformed a holiday associated with hope into a moment of collective grief. Vigils were held across Southern California. Families gathered to mourn, light candles, and share stories about loved ones lost. Community leaders spoke openly about fear replacing routine. Dance studios that had once been places of connection now felt vulnerable. The Star Ballroom dance studio never reopened after the shooting. Its closure became a lasting symbol of what was taken that night. The Lai Ballroom in Alhambra eventually resumed operations, carrying with it the memory of a moment when violence was interrupted before it could repeat itself. And as this video closes, if you found these stories interesting, please subscribe to my channel for more real crime deep dives that reveal what others overlook.